Excellent. Welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a conversation about budget reconciliation. I'm Sarah Binder. I'm here with my colleague, Molly Reynolds. We are both senior fellows with Governance Studies program at Brookings. We have both written books about the Senate filibuster. Molly's book examines ways to get around the filibuster, including using reconciliation. Her book is Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. My book is on the political history of the filibuster, co-authored with a colleague, Steve Smith, and it is called Politics or Principle, ? Filibustering in the U.S. Senate. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes today answering some common questions about reconciliation. For those of you who have submitted questions in advance, thank you. And we'll cover, I think, a lot of the ground that you were curious about in our conversation. And then we'll turn to more audience questions. If you're viewing live, you can submit questions for us by emailing events@brookings.edu or via hashtag, or Twitter by using the hashtag reconciliation101. So let's go. Molly, why don't you start us off? What exactly is a reconciliation bill? And along the way, maybe help us understand what isn't a reconciliation bill.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So budget reconciliation is an optional part of the budget process that makes changes to one type of federal spending, known as mandatory spending, to revenue, or to the debt limit. Mandatory spending is federal spending that's handled outside of the annual discretionary appropriations process. Often, though certainly not always, because the amount of spending is determined by something like a formula or eligibility criteria. So things like Medicare. Each budget resolution, which is the overall blueprint that kicks off the congressional budget process, each one of those can produce up to 3 reconciliation bills. One that affects only revenue, one that affects only spending, and one that affects the debt limit. In practice, it's pretty hard to do major policy change without touching revenue and spending together. So really, we're talking about each budget resolution doing 2 reconciliation bills in practice. As we learned recently, you can kind of unlock additional attempts at the reconciliation process by revising a budget resolution. This was the subject of some headlines about a month ago. But here, and this will, I think, be a pretty common theme for our conversation today, timing is actually a really big factor, that even if the rules of the process and the interpretation of the rules allow for you to do something, the constraints of the calendar and the schedule can actually be as restrictive on how the reconciliation process unfolds. We'll talk about this in a little bit in more detail, but the sort of big, powerful thing about the reconciliation process is that it allows for these bills to move through the Senate without the possibility of a filibuster. So instead of needing 60 votes to invoke cloture and end debate, you can do that with a simple majority. That has to do with the fact that under the rules set forth in the Congressional Budget Act, there's a limitation on how long a reconciliation bill can be debated. So once the time for debate is over, that's it. The Senate moves to a vote. And that has the effect, again, of preventing the possibility of a filibuster. Reconciliation bills can change existing programs, they can create new programs, they can eliminate programs, but overall, the process, again, is limited by various rules. The Byrd Rule, which we'll talk about later, is the most notable of these. There are also rules that restrict what kinds of particularly amendments are permitted during Senate consideration. I sort of divide the rules that shape the process into ones that restrict the subject matter of a reconciliation bill. So reconciliation bills have to be budgetary in nature, and the budgetary effects of things in reconciliation bills can't be what we call merely incidental. can unpack that in a little bit. And then the size of a reconciliation bill is also restricted. For example, reconciliation bills must be fully paid for beyond a certain time period covered by the bill. Usually that's 10 years. And that has the effect of things like in the case of the Bush tax cuts, which were handled through reconciliation, the Trump tax cuts, which were handled through reconciliation. Those contain provisions that expire. So that's one of the constraints put on by the rules of the process. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of what reconciliation is, what reconciliation isn't. Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about kind of why this exists? Like, why do we have this kind of complicated but really important legislative process?
Sure. So why does reconciliation exist? I think first, it's good to keep in mind, it's like a great example of a practice, a rule, sort of an institution created for one purpose at a particular moment in political time. And then as conditions change, politicians, and they're very strategic, usually party leaders, like find new uses for that established tools. And often they're uses that probably might not have been envisioned when the particular lawmakers who wrote the rule or the law probably didn't envision how they might be used in the future. And it's not that unusual a thing in Congress, right, that the rules last longer typically than the politicians who created them. And so it creates these opportunities for this seemingly very complicated procedures that probably didn't look so complicated when they wrote them. So in the case of reconciliation, as you suggested, it comes from the 1974 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. I think, keep in mind, it was the 1970s, a period of very large Democratic majorities, ideologically diverse Republican and Democratic parties, growing entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory programs created largely during the Great Society, 1960s Congresses. Spending, as you suggested, that's outside of the annual appropriations process. And on top of sort of growing budgets and social spending, we have very tough institutional conflict between Congress and the Republican president, Richard Nixon. Conflicts obviously over the war in Southeast Asia, but also about federal spending and Congress's power of the purse, like Congress's power to determine where the executives should spend from the Treasury. Those conflicts add up to the Budget Act in 1974. So you've kind of laid out just briefly the process. Reconciliation played a special role there, as you suggested, and we can kind of skip through, I guess, some of the details of the original Budget Act. But the point was that there would actually be two budget resolutions. One would lay out a budget blueprint, revenues, spending, and debt limits for the coming fiscal year. They'd go through the spending, the appropriations process, sort of the annual spending. And then they were supposed to do a second budget resolution that would sort of set more, in theory, binding limits. And then to get the two budget resolutions, spending revenues to match up, as you said, it's a tight calendar, but you can make some last minute changes in laws to bring revenues and spendings in line with the priorities of the budget resolution. So reconciliation was that sort of the cleanup, right? This is your opportunity at the end of the process to make the first and second budget resolutions line up. Now, as it turns out, I think lawmakers pretty quickly figured out it was a little cumbersome. Second resolution, they pass a couple, but when they first try reconciliation, and I guess it was 1979 or 1980, end of the Carter administration, they put the instructions, right? As the resolution, you need reconciliation instructions. They stick it to the first budget resolution. And so the second resolution, I mean, I'm not that type of doctor, but I've always thought of it sort of like a second resolution was like the appendix, like turns out you didn't need it. So you have a resolution and now we have the option of doing reconciliation. It gets used reasonably frequently, but not until really the 1980s. So late 70s, they're not doing it. We have, I think, almost 24 signed into law since the first one in 1980. It's changed a little bit over time. Molly mentioned the 10-year budget window. Originally, I think it was a 1-year budget resolution window, and then a 5 years, like how many years would be covered. Nothing stops them, I don't believe, at 10, right? I wouldn't be surprised to see a future party make the window even larger to create more opportunities for spending more money or cutting more taxes. But the key part, of course, is what you alluded to, Molly, but haven't mentioned, is you can't filibuster the reconciliation bills. Molly, why not? Like, I thought people loved the filibuster, especially senators. So what's that all about?
Yeah, so I think here it's really important to come back to the process as you originally, as you sort of laid it out, Sarah, as it was originally designed in the 74 Act. And so you were talking about how under the 74 Act, there would be a first budget resolution in the spring. There would be a second budget resolution in the fall. And then there would be this period just before the start of a new fiscal year where Congress might need to act pretty quickly to sort of bring the budget process kind of to a close before the federal government's new fiscal year started on October 1st. And so this possible need to be pretty speedy, to go pretty quickly, is a big part of what motivated this desire to put a limitation on how long a reconciliation bill could be debated in the Senate. The idea was that Congress might need to move fast, and that limiting how long you could talk about the reconciliation bill would help make that possible. Congress realized pretty quickly that even with the debate limitation, that very small window for action was actually probably too small. That's part of why, as you said, we eventually get the reconciliation process moving from the second budget resolution to the first budget resolution, and then eventually the second budget resolution gets, excised via arthroscopic surgery, like an appendix. This reconciliation is not it's I think worth noting, not the only example of this kind of debate limitation in the Senate. We have other instances where Congress decides that particular pieces of legislation should be protected from a filibuster. Generally, that's either because Congress wants to sort of avoid blame, kind of deflect responsibility to some other actor, and then have that proposal that someone else comes up with move through in a protected way, or because Congress wants to enhance this ability to oversee the executive branch. Reconciliation is probably the most consequential of these debate limitations in the Senate, but again, it's not the only one. And I think that as we think about the use of reconciliation in the very contemporary Congress, mulling over the degree to which having reconciliation as this filibuster protected option for moving certain types of legislation has potentially helped keep the filibuster around, because reconciliation exists as a consistent outlet for certain types of policy changes. So you sort of can say, okay, we'll do that through reconciliation. That can't be filibustered, but then we'll keep the filibuster around for legislation more generally. I've sort of brought up the idea here that over time, reconciliation has become this tool of the majority party in the Senate to pursue its goals. Has that always been the case, Sarah? Like, was reconciliation ever bipartisan? How did that change? And do we think that reconciliation kind of benefits one party more than the other?
So I think it's very tempting to tell a story that reconciliation has become more partisan over the decades as the two parties have become more ideologically polarized, more electorally competitive, and also just where there's more sort of partisan team play in Congress, right? My team's for it, so your team's against it. And there's some truth to that, right? We certainly see a handful of bipartisan votes on reconciliation in the 1980s, in a period where the parties weren't so at odds with one another. And now, granted, there are we have a small n here, not a lot of examples here, but we now see exclusively, it seems, partisan votes, right? The Trump tax cuts done in reconciliation 2017, no Democrats voted for it, or Biden's pandemic relief bill done in reconciliation this year, no Republicans voting for it. My sense is, in part because I've read your book. So my sense on this issue of partisan manipulation of reconciliation, my sense is that reconciliation from the get-go with the Reagan administration, sort of kicking it up a big notch from the Carter administration's use, that the Reagan administration really in the early 1980s is already using it as an instrument to pursue Republican policy agendas, right? They're using it as a tool really to pare back spending favored by Democrats, spending on welfare programs, what we used to call food stamps. That is, the rules of reconciliation enabled Republicans who, for the first time in decades, then got the control of the Senate plus the White House, right, to set the agenda for these cuts and entitlements that they couldn't get through the regular legislative process. So we want to be careful thinking that it was all bipartisan and now it's newly partisan. But I think the evolution here is that parties have found a way to exploit reconciliation for top priorities, regardless of their impact on federal deficits. And they've both done it in their own favored ways, right? That Republicans favor tax cuts largely and can use a reconciliation easily to do that at the cost of deficit. And also Democrats, for their turn, want to use it more for social welfare directed programs. So the transformation here is it's no longer a budget cutting tool. So reconciliation 2017, tax cuts, Republicans said it would pay for themselves, but by many estimates, it cost the government perhaps $2 trillion in revenues. And of course, then vice versa for the Democrats in pandemic aid. Democrats, I think, were upfront about the cost. They justified it as necessary to get us out of pandemic and back to work. But those aren't paid for, well, narrowly. We can get a Byrd Rule. But the transformation here is that both parties have found a way to really fine tune it and hone it. And as the parties have become more at odds with one another, it definitely looks more partisan because there are no cross-pressured members who are going to cross the aisle to use it for the other party. Now, of course, there, as you intimated, there is a constraint on the majority party, well, several constraints, but certainly the one that looms large is the Byrd Rule. So, Molly, you want to tell us a little bit about the Byrd Rule, what it is, why we have it, and this last part, this might be like Reconciliation 201, we might not want to get to, but why is it so darn complicated? Like, why does it end up being so complicated, I guess is my question. So.
Sure. So the Byrd Rule basically limits the content of reconciliation bills. It's added to the process in 1985, modified somewhat in 1986 and 1987, and then made permanent in 1990. And it is named for Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. And he basically, in the mid-'80s, had two reasons that he offered for needing to place some limitations on what could be in a reconciliation bill. So the first was that Congress was trying, sort of caught on to the one neat trick that was reconciliation. I was trying to add things to reconciliation bills that didn't serve the goal of reducing the deficit. And adding these additional non-deficit reducing provisions to the bill was kind of adding drama and controversy to the process, which was making it harder for Congress to make progress on this underlying goal of reducing the deficit. It's one of the ways that the process sort of was originally used to achieve deficit reduction was basically by telling lots of congressional committees in those reconciliation instructions that you mentioned earlier, Sarah, that they had to report out legislation that would reduce the deficit by some prescribed amount. And then, lots of committees would be set to work on this goal. They would all report back their proposals for achieving that amount of deficit reduction, and then Congress would take one vote on the whole package. And the idea was kind of everyone should have some role in achieving this goal. Everyone should be required to share some of the pain necessary to actually reduce the federal deficit. And so if that was the central goal of the process, and that was how it was designed to work, adding more things that were not intended to reduce the deficit to the process was making it harder to achieve that goal. The other sort of justification that Byrd gave was that by making reconciliation bills bigger and bigger and including more things in them without the threat of a filibuster, that was using that expedited process was undermining the deliberative nature of the Senate. And so Byrd offers this rule with these restrictions, again, on what can be in a reconciliation bill. Again, speaking both to the content, the most significant piece there is the part where provisions in a reconciliation bill have to be budgetary in nature, and their budgetary effects can't be just merely incidental to the goal of the provision. Why is it so complicated? I give a couple of reasons. One is, I think, actually has to do with the fact that the rule, like all Senate rules, is not self-enforcing. So the only way that we sort of have footprints of a Byrd Rule violation in the Senate's record comes from something actually being challenged on the floor as a potential Byrd Rule violation, and then there being a vote either to waive the Byrd Rule or on the ruling of the chair on whether or not something violates the Byrd Rule. And so, because there are lots of potential Byrd Rule violations that we don't ever see, and also there might be provisions in a reconciliation bill that violate the Byrd Rule. But if more than 60 senators, which is what it would take to waive the Byrd Rule and keep a provision that is in violation of it in a bill. If there is a supermajority of senators who supports a particular provision, maybe we never know that might have been a violation. So it's that kind of uncertainty around it, the very light footprints that the Byrd can leave is one reason that it's complicated. Another is that we don't have, say, a statutory definition of what merely incidental means. There's a real sort of, I think we're going to talk about the Parliamentarian and her role in this process in a minute, but there's a real sort of, you know it when you see it element to the Byrd Rule, and that there's a lot about the way it's been interpreted over time that doesn't come from underlying statutory language. Another reason why I think it's gotten so complicated goes back to something you were talking about in your answer to the previous question, Sarah, which is that I think there's more pressure on the reconciliation process now than there was in the 80s. So you're absolutely right that even in the 80s, beginning from the first major use of the reconciliation process, the procedures were used to achieve goals that were important to the Senate's majority party. But they were not at that point the only way a majority party might be able to try and achieve some of its goals, particularly if those goals had some bipartisan support. Now, I think for a lot of legislative items, and I think we're seeing this true this year, that reconciliation becomes the only way that a majority party in the Senate feels like it can accomplish some of the things that it wants to do. And as the process is asked to bear more and more of those policy agenda items, I think that increases the complexity of the process as well. And then the last thing I'll say is has to do with how the consequences of the Byrd Rule for the structure of a reconciliation bill. And so because the rule is applied to individual provisions in a bill, it can be the case that if one provision is deemed to be a violation of the Byrd Rule, that can kind of if you sort of pull on that one string, or sort of pull on that feather, if we're going to continue our bird metaphor here, that has the potential to unwind the rest of the bill, either policy-wise. There are some, I think if we look back at the Republicans' failed attempt to repeal the ACA using reconciliation in 2017, there were some pieces of how they had sort of constructed a bill that was going to accomplish this goal of repealing the ACA that were deemed to be a violation of the rules, that once you sort of pulled that one brick out of the wall, it made it harder from a sort of policy perspective to sustain the rest of the wall. Or this could happen politically as well. And I think we saw this as a kind of potential issue in the spring with the American Rescue Plan, when we had the debate over whether or not that bill would include an increase to the federal minimum wage. And that ended up coming out of the bill because the parliamentarian advised that it was in violation of the Byrd Rule. But that had sort of political consequences or potential political consequences for the coalition that was needed to support the legislation. So I've mentioned in sort of describing the complexity of this process, I've mentioned the parliamentarian plays a really important role here. Can you talk a little bit about that role, Sarah? Why has the job become particularly controversial, and what role does the parliamentarian play beyond just placing the Byrd Rule here? What other rules might come into play?
Sure. So just as a sort of framework here, like many bodies, decision-making bodies have parliamentarians, not just the Senate. House has one. My congregation in Northwest DC has one. I myself am a parliamentarian for a faculty senate. But in any of these decision-making bodies, right, we typically have a governing document, could be my temple bylaws, could be the faculty code, or in the Senate case, a set of formal standing rules of the chamber, a set of precedents, or think of them interpretations of the rules, how the rules have been applied in the past to particular circumstances, and then in more informal practices, norms, and so forth. But parliamentarians give advice. They provide information to senators or to leaders informally. They advise more formally the presiding officer on how the parliamentarian would interpret or apply the rules, say the Byrd Rule or other provisions of the Budget Act, to say what do the rules require or suggest or allow in one particular situation or the other. Sometimes the advice is black and white. In part, perhaps we've seen this movie before, right? This is a situation we've encountered. It could be, say, can reconciliation be used to ban funding for Planned Parenthood? And a decision is made once in the 90s, and every time it comes up, it's relatively easy for the parliamentarian to provide that advice from past practice. But other times it's gray, right? And those are the situations, I think, that increasingly raise people outside the Senate, right, raise hackles, right? I've been sort of shocked how many people at least think they know what the parliamentarian's role is, but kind of misunderstand it to think that the parliamentarian is telling senators what they can do and what they can't. But she's not. She's advising. And it's always first the presiding officer, the chair, and I think by a I would call it like Anglo-American legislative parliamentary practice, as the chair follows advice. And in theory, we don't want the chair kind of freelancing on his or her own policy preferences to make rulings. But at the end of the day, the Senate is the one that sets its precedents or its interpretations. So what is the parliamentarian doing here in the context of reconciliation? Off the floor before reconciliation, as it's being crafted, as you said, she can provide advice to hear from competing teams, as it were, parties or senators, about why they think a provision fits in a reconciliation bill or not. She gives advice. And by and large, my sense is, because they probably don't, for whatever reason, the minimum wage one you raised, don't want to leave the footprint for whatever reason it is, probably in part because they may disagree within the party. But the parliamentarian advice tends to kind of carry the day, even though it's just informal. So as things become more partisan, and given that 50-50 divide in the Senate, meaning there is no wiggle room at all, there's sort of I think a kind of conservative status quo bias here that the majority and senators and leaders seem not willing or don't have the votes to push the envelope to try to stretch reconciliation even more. I see we have questions coming in. Let's see. I'll start here because it's related and ask Molly a question from Ron Elving from NPR. Who really decides how many times reconciliation can be used and what it may include?
Yeah, so I think, Sarah, your answer to the question about the parliamentarian speaks to this really well. So I'm just going to underline a couple of the things that you said, which is that there's the sort of the difference between what the parliamentarian advises and what the Senate is actually kind of willing to do. And so, the parliamentarian could say that, something is a potential violation of the Byrd Rule, and the Senate, the drafters of the bill could say, okay, we hear you, parliamentarian, but we are going to ignore your advice, keep it in the bill. There could be a challenge to that provision on the floor, and if there's sort of, without going through the extremely weedsy parliamentary steps here, it is possible for a simple majority of senators to, so in the current Senate, the 50 Democrats plus the tie-breaking vote of the vice president to sort of disregard the advice of the parliamentarian. But I think it's clear, or in many situations it's clear, that there's a difference between sort of what a majority of the Senate wants to do policy-wise and maybe what they're willing to do rules-wise, stretching the process to actually make that happen, and that there's a kind of an interest that senators have in preserving the equilibrium that is the parliamentarian as a trusted sort of nonpartisan source of advice in the Senate, because as you were saying at the start of your answer, this is not the only thing that the Senate parliamentarian does. She does not exist only to advise the Senate on what is and is not a violation of the Byrd Rule. And there are lots of other situations where it's in the shared interest of senators to have a kind of parliamentary referee who they all are willing to listen to. And so I think that as we kind of think about these questions of what could really happen, what are the parliamentary edge cases, it's important to remember that there is a difference between what some senators might support on policy grounds and what they're actually willing to do to make it happen.
With the warning that some of these questions coming in are excellent, but they could be reconciliation 301 and we're live. So, but we're gonna do our best here. John Seitz from the U.S. Senate. Oops, name should be naming. Does a debt ceiling increase survive a bird bath in the Senate? I'll give that one to Molly.
Sure. So reconciliation can touch the debt limit. Exactly how it can make changes to the debt limit is a little bit more complicated. So the process could definitely be used to raise the debt ceiling. It probably could not be used to eliminate the debt ceiling entirely, to sort of do away with the concept of the debt limit. And the question of suspending the debt limit, to my understanding, is a little more complicated. I don't know, Sarah, if you have any thoughts on sort of that middle ground. What's important to note on this, as well as many other hypotheticals about reconciliation, is the difference between, again, what could happen and what seems likely to happen. It remains, I think, unclear to me, Sarah, I don't know if you know or suspect differently, whether Democrats will decide that reconciliation is the way that they want to deal with the debt limit. It's clear that the debt limit needs to be dealt with. Exactly when is unclear. And so how that fits into kind of the overall timing puzzle, I think, again, is an open question. I don't know if you have anything to add.
That's my sense. And now there may be, financial accounting reasons why a party's have late preferred suspending the debt limit versus increasing to a certain level. My sense has been that suspending is more politically palatable because you're not giving anybody a target number to be used against your party. And so, but then, as you suggested, if that doesn't score, then perhaps that's taken off the table, but that could push Democrats to look for an alternative mechanism for something perhaps on appropriations, which is also ultimately a must pass.
So this might also be a good moment, Sarah, to just like give a little bit of perspective on like where are we right now? What seems to be the plan of the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress for using reconciliation? How many bills are we talking about? You know, I just mentioned it's not clear whether the debt limit, this is the legislative process that they'll use to deal with the debt limit or not, but kind of where are we? So
again, with the caveat that there could well be people watching today who are working on these issues. From the outside, it appears to be there are, not to mix metaphors, there are a couple balls that are attempting to be in the air at the same time. And I am not a juggler. And so here I am trying to use my hands to illustrate juggling. It seems the first one route could well be, or at least what seems to be the current train track, is for the bipartisan, to the extent it remains bipartisan, but it seems to have legs here, infrastructure bill, hard or physical infrastructure bill, to continue through the usual, well, unconventional, usual, irregular order, such as it was, to produce a plan to come through the Senate this summer first, and then to be, in theory, passed and sent to the House, where it would seem that the Speaker would hold it for a while, as is the power of the Speaker and the majority party to set the agenda there. At the same time, already underway appears to be the parallel track, as it were, of a reconciliation bill that would tackle the Democrats, the Biden parts of the family plan, and what else might be in the jobs plan, more social or soft infrastructure. Under Plan 1, it seems that we'd have dual, as they call them, tandem. That is, bipartisan would go first, and then reconciliation resolution would come up in the Senate that has been probably pre-negotiated with the House, but letting the Senate go first. That includes reconciliation instructions, so that once the House agrees to the resolution, then work can get underway at the same time on a reconciliation bill, perhaps to make it to the Senate floor in I presume September-ish, go to the House. And then the Democrats would have both the bipartisan and the partisan, as it were, package to be passed and signed at once. I think that seems to be the model that Democrats are working towards, but with the fallback. And then I think there are some, possibly unanswerable questions about reconciliation as the fallback, folding in the bipartisan hard infrastructure into the social infrastructure. And I suppose then the question is, how do they write the reconciliation instructions to committees with the possibility that it would have to be large enough and directed to the right committees to add the bipartisan bill into one gigantic reconciliation bill? I take it that's the fallback plan. But there are limits, there are political limits. There's the limits of how much Joe Manchin and colleagues may be willing to put into either form of a reconciliation, either the soft or the soft plus hard. And as you pointed out at the outset, time's ticking. We have seen reconciliation bills in even numbered election years, but I don't think that's the hope, right? I think the plan is to probably get it done, were that possible, before they start into the election year and more overt campaigning, as it were.
So, Sarah, you brought up the question of sort of instructions to committees. We have a question from Paul Heldman about that, which is about how specific can the reconciliation instructions be to the committees of jurisdiction. So generally, the instructions do not sort of tell committees exactly which programs they should make changes in to achieve the prescribed amount of either deficit reductions, spending increases, revenue increases, revenue decreases, whatever. They don't generally contain sort of programmatic directions. That said, there is sort of a kind of behind the scenes process that goes on where so in order to kind of decide how big the instruction should be, you've developed some sense of what's likely to be achieved through those instructions before you kind of decide on the number. In the case of some committees, ones that don't actually have a lot of mandatory spending in their jurisdiction, there are only so many levers they can pull. So you have a sense of like what those levers might be. But again, generally, it does not appear in the instructions themselves. But there's often, and I think that's part of what's happening kind of behind the scenes right now, and settling on those numbers is what are the changes that are likely to what are the building blocks that are likely to make up those changes.
This is Reconciliation 401, but I think we owe it to our viewers to rise to the challenge. I'm going to ask the one maybe, and I think you and I have kind of talked through this before, a question from Bill Signer of the Carmen Group. On what statutory basis did the Senate Parliamentarian rule that if you want more than one reconciliation bill in a year, then it must be reported out of committee with at least one member from the minority party?
Go ahead, you can start.
I was going to ask you. I'm going to give it to you for what do these additional resolutions look like, and then we can piece together the parts about auto discharge and so forth, as it were.
Yeah, so in the Congressional Budget Act, that again sets up the possibility of using reconciliation, that law provides for the opportunity to revise a budget resolution. And if you sort of read the debate over the original passage of the act and some other sort of speeches and committee reports and all that sort of thing from early uses of the Budget Act, the kind of underlying idea was that, again, in this era of multiple budget resolutions, that conditions might be fluid. Things might happen, like an external crisis in the economy, where Congress might need the ability to revise, to go back and make changes to its budget blueprint. So that's why when writing the Budget Act, Congress provided for the possibility of revising a budget resolution. And so we sort of, in part, again, because reconciliation has become this kind of one neat trick, this key to unlock a filibuster-proof process that's more important in the contemporary Congress than I think it used to be. We've seen congressional majorities try to figure out ways to use it in bigger ways, or in this case, more often. And so we had this question about whether Congress could go back and, having taken the budget resolution that they passed in, I believe, February, to unlock the reconciliation process that created the American Rescue Plan that Congress passed, that President Biden signed into law in March. Could they go back to that February budget resolution, revise it in a way that would unlock a second reconciliation process for the current fiscal year that we are currently in, that runs to the end of September? And so, and if they could, under this part of the Budget Act that allowed for revisions, could they? What could they do with it? And so that was the sort of the question that the Parliamentarian opined on, I believe, sometime last month. Sarah, we have just a couple minutes left if you want to sort of take on this part about discharge, and then we'll wrap up.
So I think the simplest version is that in the Congressional Budget Act, when applied to your first budget resolution in a normal circumstance, there is in effect an auto discharge because there's a date by which the resolution has to be adopted. it sounds like from the reporting that the parliamentarian is saying there is no auto discharge on a revised or an amended budget resolution. And so the budget committee would have to vote it out. We are in a 50-50 Senate. The parliamentarian does police whether or not committees essentially conform with quorum, with reporting rules, and we can save that for another day. But it sounds like, given a 50-50 Senate, given that Republicans vote against it, it sounds like, given that Republicans could basically void a quorum to prevent the Democrats from voting to discharge it, that it would not be possible then, without Republican support, to get it out of the committee. Now that, I think there's still some question marks, at least in my head, about why the leader can't discharge it and then vote on the floor and so forth. But that seems to be like a confluence of the law, an unused provision, the 50-50 Senate, and then advice from on high, as it were, from the parliamentarian. So it seems quite complicated, but I think it's because there's so many moving parts here in ways that haven't been seen before, that gives rise to, hey, why would you have to require a Republican? So I think it's a circumstance here of contingent and interesting events.
The last thing that I just to say one thing is that we've laid all this out, but this is another case where the constraints aren't just kind of what the law says or what the parliamentarian's interpretation of the law says and what the Senate, where the Senate is willing to push things. It's also the calendar. And so there are real questions about, given both the amount of floor time that handling a reconciliation bill takes, and to go back to Sarah's sort of two moving trains, hitching the trains together piece, the degree to which politically, it is challenging to say to some parts of your coalition, we're going to put things in one reconciliation bill and hold some things for a second reconciliation bill, and that may or may not come to pass. So sort of all of that, which is, again, outside, those are constraints outside of the ones that the rules place on the process. Those are also playing a role here. In the world of split majorities, it's a really tough battle, I think, all around for this particular majority unified party control. Okay, on that note about reconciliation, thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again another time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.